This is the Mixed Martial Arts Beat for the second week of April 2014. Hello again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. So much to discuss on this week's episode. We're talking the Diaz brothers versus the UFC. Jake Shields released from the UFC. Alistair Overeem potentially going to a new camp. And of course, the Big Nog versus Roy Nelson fight in Abu Dhabi on Friday. First, let us introduce the panel. You know him. He is from MMAfighting.com and the Sirius XM Fight Club. He is Luke Thomas. The man with the shirt is back, Jeff Wagenheim of Sports Illustrated. And the man with the hat of MMAfighting.com, Mr. Chuck Mittenhall.
Good to have you guys back. All the syllables that Jack left over here.
Yeah, that's right. You guys have your work cut out for you. Great stuff last week. Looking forward to this week's show with you guys back in the mix here. So let's talk about the Diaz brothers. On Tuesday, Nate Diaz, talking to MMAfighting.com, had a whole lot to say about his issues with the UFC and wanting a new contract and not really all that eager to come back with the contract that he currently has. On Wednesday, Nick Diaz, talking to MMAfighting.com, kind of saying a lot of the same stuff and saying that he doesn't want to return to the UFC for anything less than $500,000. You don't want to kind of group them together because they're two different people with different problems. But as I mentioned, a lot of the same stuff. Do any of them have a leg to stand on?
I'm not sure what the kind of question that is. Well, from whose vantage point? You mean their own?
Sure. Well, as an outsider, you have two guys who have signed a contract.
Yep.
There's a contract with terms that is not expired, but they want more money. They want to renegotiate.
I see.
Based on their drawing power, you have to admit that they are two of the biggest draws in their respective divisions. Sure. Based on their drawing power, what they do for the sport and all that stuff, should the UFC consider this? Given the current landscape of the UFC, lack of stars, etc.
All right, so speaking personally, I would like to see them reconsider, right? So
who's they?
UFC.
Okay.
Not the Diaz brothers. I mean, listen, there's an argument to be made against the Diaz brothers, which is, as you just stated, look, these guys signed contracts. They're not dumb. They understand what they were getting in on. They went through negotiations to get the Nick Diaz contract and the Nate Diaz contract, and we're now sort of almost at a sunset point where it's like you're just now raising concerns about this. I understand that argument. I also understand their argument, which is that in the Nate Diaz case, it seems to be that he didn't really understand what his power was. He didn't really leverage it during negotiations. He didn't really take full advantage. It was only what the Gilbert Melendez situation illuminated that he was like, oh my God, I left so much money on the table. Nick Diaz has been sort of clear. I think if you put him in a huge fight, he'll do it. His situation is not that my entire contract is bogus. Individual fights may not make sense. But the reality...
He has also said, for this amount of money that I'm getting now, I won't even fight for the belt. He's not interested in that.
That's true, but you know, listen, if St. Pierre came back and he got a rematch, I think he would take that even if it was non-title, just because of the pay-per-view money, right? So there's wiggle room there. But for me, the issue is, and we'll get to Jake Shields in a minute, to me they're totally related. If you're going to die by the sword, you might as well live by it. In other words, if we live in a world where your skill doesn't necessarily matter relative to your entertainment value, your drawing power, then why not use that against the UFC if you have the power? Which is to say, we know that they're skilled, that's fine, but we also know they have tremendous drawing power, maybe not so much on pay-per-view, but at the gate certainly, to generate buzz, to fill out a card. Why not use that if you have it? Why not find the optimal way to get what you want if you have it, right? So Jake Shields never had any of that, and he suffered as a consequence. The Diaz brothers have it in spades. Are they not supposed to use that? Are we really going to suggest, after the tenure that Nate Diaz has had, 60 and 60, is his maximum earning potential? I don't think so. I think they can explore that again, and if he can leverage the media to get that situation fixed, I'm not sure I understand the problem.
Are you sympathetic towards what they're saying?
Yeah, well, this is something that's sort of endemic in sports as a whole, not just MMA.
Sure.
And you know, I've always been one of those people who would see some athlete sign a 5-year contract with a team and have a really great season, and then want to renegotiate. And they would always sort of gnawed at me. I always thought, well, what if this was a baseball player who batted .210? Is he going to give money back from that big contract he signed? No, nobody's ever going to do that. It's never happened. So I've always been this well, you sign a contract, you know, live with it. But the thing is that in MMA particularly, these guys do negotiate kind of from a position of weakness. They don't really have a lot of leverage when they're going into negotiations. And the one thing they do have is the court of public opinion. And so if they can, in the middle of they do have a contract that's still valid, and the UFC has all the right to say, look, you got to live with it, you got to live with it. But if enough people out there start to sympathize with these guys, things might change. And that's the only power they have right now. And so why not use it? These guys, you know, Nate and Nick are both, they are both entertaining fighters. But beyond that, they're also sort of entertaining personalities, and they're engaging personalities. They're the kind of guys that a lot of fans can get behind, even when they do things that seem sort of antisocial and stuff that sort of is perplexing to us. Fans seem to get behind these guys, so you know you got to go with what you got. That's your ammunition. Go with it.
Part of the fascinating thing about the Diaz is always there's this almost like we talk about them being raw and sort of unpredictable and all these things, entertainment. But there's like this innocence behind it all. Like it's like they're innocent in what they do. You know, like the contract stuff. They're not really putting full thought into those things. It seems like when they're happening, just like they're not putting they're not putting business sense into anything until it's after the fact almost. You know what I'm saying? Like that's just how they are. And it's almost like at some point things dawn on them. They start to feel like they're being suckered. And then it comes out in these ways. We've seen it sort of in other ways throughout their course of time. It all adds to their allure, honestly. It's just there's something very honest and innocent and very translatable about that stuff. And actually, when Nick Diaz, the thing that stood out to me about this interview was, you know, he was saying that he didn't really want to be fighting. He didn't, you know, that wasn't something he enjoyed. Which actually strikes a sane note. Like there's sanity to what he's saying. Like we always talk about, he's kind of a nutcase, whatever, but he's actually sort of like, you know, he's talking sense right there. Like, you know, I don't really want to go out there and get punched unless I'm getting paid for it, especially knowing, you know, it's now occurred to him, I guess, as full as it's going to, that he's a draw, especially right now, the dearth of big events that they have. We talked about this months ago that, you know, there might be time to get Nick Diaz involved again because we know he'll draw in that division, which traditionally has drawn. He might be the biggest star in that division right now. So I mean, it's just there's so many fascinating factors with the Diaz brothers. It's not just one thing. It's not just the entertainment because they go out there and they fight the way they do, which is part of it. It's not just the lead up. They strike all these emotional chords. They're fun to watch. It's fun to watch them, like how everything unfolds with those guys.
You know, I actually feel more comfortable with Nick putting this in financial terms and making his demands be financial ones than I felt when he was demanding that he come out of retirement after, you know, and coming off a loss and immediately get a title shot. I mean, I'm much less comfortable with that aspect of the sport when guys who, by my measurement, do not deserve title shots are talk their way into it. You know, Chael is certainly the prime example of that, and if this Gina Carano thing happens, I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point today. You know, these are things that really gnaw at me. But when it comes to money, it's like, well, hell, whatever you can get, you know, go for it, by whatever means necessary.
Well, the number he threw out, by the way, was $500,000. Is he worth that much?
Worth. What a funny word worth is. Worth is what you can negotiate.
Sure.
And this is negotiation. Don't mistake it for anything else. This is the initial push into negotiation, which may not go nowhere. The UFC may slam the door in their face, but if what you are worth is what you can negotiate. That's one way to look at it, ultimately, at the end of the day. And of course, the environment in which the climate you can negotiate, the climate that Gilbert Melendez enjoyed is a different one than Nick and Nate Diaz certainly enjoyed. That's one aspect to look at it. The other one is simply what has Nick Diaz drawn on pay-per-view. I mentioned he was a tremendous draw. He has had one fairly subpar buy rate. He did well with Condit, 400K, rumored to be 400K, we don't know for sure. St. Pierre, pretty close to $1 million, just shy of. Which is to be expected. And then against BJ Penn at about 280K. But that was a funny card, 137. 137 was initially supposed to be Diaz and St. Pierre.
Yeah.
Then it was St. Pierre and Condit, and then St. Pierre and Condit was scrapped altogether. And it was left with BJ Penn and Nick Diaz. And I think certainly 280 is not the most impressive buy rate you can pull, but now that he's demonstrated he could do well without St. Pierre, and now he could probably be even bigger after St. Pierre. You know, listen, the UFC has a tremendous ability to say we can make money at 100, depending who's the card. You know, if you had 5 people who had pay-per-view points, maybe not so much. But depending on who's on the card, you know, I've been told you can make as much money, or you can make money on 150,000 pay-per-view buy rate. You mean to tell me Nick Diaz and Nate Diaz on the card together couldn't do 354?
Right.
Certainly they could. That's a tremendous amount of money. 500K is, as a share of revenue, is a drop in the bucket.
It's going to be interesting to see how it plays out because the UFC, I mean, Dana said it yesterday, you know, you sign the deal, come back to work, you're not making any money sitting at home. So it doesn't sound like they're all that interested in renegotiating. But if this keeps going, you know, they keep offering him fights. They offered him the Condit fight, he turned that down. They offered him, of course, now Hector Lombardi turned that down. At some point, though, should they just leave them alone? I mean, they don't have to release them because they have a contract, but should the UFC just stop trying at this point?
Well, the thing that Dana said is the same thing that general managers in every sport have said for decades. You know, ever since free agency came into not even free agency, just really since professional sports came about. So he's just, you know, as Luke said, this is part of the negotiation process. You know, when Dana White says something about that sounds very definitive, he's just stating a position that is going to be movable. Just like if Nick Diaz says he wants 500 grand, well, that's probably also a movable figure as well. So no, if they want these guys, they shouldn't just walk away from it. And look, this is a really good time to be negotiating with the UFC if you're someone with drawing power. You know, maybe at a time when all the champions are healthy and everything's going gangbusters, it may be a little tougher. But right now, they've got 4 champions who are on the shelf. They've got another champion who's doing a movie. They have just enough champions to fill the pay-per-views they have left in this year. So they don't have any room for error. Zero. If one more injury, and they're going to have to put a non-title fight probably on as a pay-per-view headliner. That's a sort of, you know, talking about buy rates, that's a dangerous thing for them to be doing.
Yeah, I feel like, you know, if they're going to dig their cleats in, sort of like what Melendez is doing, and basically saying that, you know, this is it. Either you can match this offer. Of course, his situation was different because Bellator had come aboard, but you can match this offer. You can't. They're basically saying release us, you know, or release me. This was Nate Diaz. Release me, or, you know, whatever. And Nick is like, I'm retired. I'm not coming out. That's a hardline stance. You're basically, if they keep that, the UFC doesn't want to release them. Both of those guys would be snapped up into, you know, and all of a sudden become competition for the UFC. They don't want that to happen. But I feel like that's where there's all kinds of leveraging power, I feel like, for the Diaz's, just based on that. We're sitting here talking about the Diaz's because, and everybody's talking about the Diaz's because that's what they draw. Like, people care about what they do. I can't imagine a scenario where the UFC doesn't, you know, come figure something out with them. You know how they all of a sudden just something's fixed. I sort of anticipate that happening at some point with this.
You know, this wasn't included in the piece, but one very interesting thing that Nick said to me was he believes he's more popular because of the fact that he didn't show up to that press conference than had he shown up to it. He understands why people are interested in him, and he knows that he's popular, and he knows the fans want to see him fight. He just wants to get paid what he thinks he deserves. But as an outsider, it's a weird thing to digest because here's a guy who everyone wants to see fight. We think he's still, you know, a good fighter and has value to the UFC, but he's saying he doesn't like to do it. And that's a sport that, you know, if you don't like to do it, I don't want to see you do it. I don't want to see you go in a cage and get punched in the face. And I asked him, you know, was your heart ever into it? He's like, my heart? What do you mean my heart? I did it because I got paid. I never wanted to do it, but someone was paying me and that's it. That's a scary thing to think about. This guy went in those cages. At least he's saying that now. Who knows what he thought 5, 10 years ago. He's going in those cages and doesn't like what he's doing. Who wants to support that?
That's a different thing, though. You're talking about 2 different kinds of I don't want to do this. There's one where I don't want to do this where they're not, maybe that once they did want to and their interest has faded, and they're not.
He's saying since day one I didn't want to do it.
Right, and then in the first case, let's say you had this person who did want to do it and then the interest faded, and they're no longer putting in the requisite hours and preparation to defend themselves, basically, because you're going to get murdered if you don't. That's different than Nick Diaz, who loves jiu-jitsu, loves to train, just on its own. If he could do that and live at the gym, he probably would. I don't think he likes the idea of being pigeonholed as a junkyard dog. He doesn't like the idea of being looked at and scowled and you are this violent creature who is unapproachable. I think he wants to be, I don't know, adored is the word, but understood. And I think he thinks fighting complicates that.
This might be a coincidence, but their good buddy Jake Shields was released by the UFC. It came out on Monday. So let's move on from the Diaz brothers as we talk about him. But I do think there is some kind of relation there. But maybe the timing of it all is somewhat coincidental. This has been brewing for a long time with the Diaz brothers. Were you surprised when you got the news, when you heard the news that Shields had been released?
I wasn't surprised because, well, I mean, I guess I'm always a little bit surprised when I hear that anybody gets cut who's a really good fighter. But I wasn't really surprised because it's sort of a reenactment of a story we've seen play out before. The precedent
is there.
Well, yeah, of course. I mean, you know, John Fitch, Okami to some extent as well. These are guys who were, you know, it seems as though the model the UFC has now, you know, set out the template. They say, okay, well, you know, if you're a guy who we don't consider entertaining, we're going to let you stay with us, and as long as you keep winning, win, and get up to the top, and present yourself as a legitimate title challenger. But once you get knocked down a few pegs and we consider you no longer at that level, goodbye. And that seems to be the thing. Now guys who are more entertaining don't have to face it. They sort of have two opportunities. They can become title challengers, and if they're not, then they become guys who just provide entertainment. But guys like Fitch, like Okami, and like Shields, they only have one avenue to a UFC career, and it means to win. And so, especially the last fight, Shields lost. He was pretty he got dominated in that fight. So it wasn't just a matter of a decision that squeaked away from him. He got dominated. So it didn't surprise me too much.
I don't really believe in the dwindling of skills thing that's been bounced around here. He's 35 years old. We saw him get battered. Yeah, we saw him get battered in the same way by Dan Henderson. He went on a tear after that. My thing is his predictability. This is always one of those things. When we were talking about John Fitch, it was always like, well, you could sort of forecast exactly what was going to happen in the John Fitch fight. He's going to get him down, he's going to keep him there, he's going to pound him, but it's going to go to the decision. Well, that was the same thing with Jake Shields. You'd have to go all the way back to 2009 to find where he won something besides the decision. It was against Robbie Lawler when he got the choke out. And at that time, he was choking. He was submitting a lot of guys. He had about 4 or 5 in a row, and then he beat Dan Henderson. And there was all of a sudden the UFC was on level. There was a lot of volatility to his game. It seemed like we could you know what's going to happen. Since then, it's just sort of plateaued. We've been seeing him very much in predictable matches, even the ones where he's supposed to get sort of smashed a little bit. He does. So it's one of those things where I feel like there's just no drama when you're talking about his fights. And then I've been to a couple of fights. I'm sure all of you guys have, where the arena, the noise in the arena just sort of shifts into into idle as he's fighting. I was at the Ed Herman fight, for instance, and it just the energy level just sort of dies, and it's a reflection of his style and his ability to sort of bottle up an opponent's aggression and turn it into his own thing. I mean, it's a really amazing thing that he does, but it's just not that fan friendly. And I could guarantee you that the UFC looks at that, has been around it enough, and they're probably, just like with Fitch and Okami, looking for the time that we might say, you know what, this might be best to part ways.
I disagree a little bit. Yeah. There's a little bit of blame to go around everywhere, I suppose, but I don't think it's true at all that his skills didn't diminish. I think they definitely diminished, which is to say, I don't think he got worse at passing guard. I don't think he got worse at applying guillotines, but he started the UFC at 31. Yeah. He's 35 now. You are not the same athlete anymore as you were in 25. Moreover, he was a guy when he was facing the Akira Kikuchis of the world, when he could just basically rely on really good wrestling and really good aggressive jiu-jitsu, guillotines from mount, that sort of thing. The game caught up, and you have to be a guy in jiu-jitsu now who can cause physical damage. That's not the guy Jake Shields is. So did he get worse per se? No, I wouldn't say that. But the rest of the guys found ways around that pretty clearly at this point. In terms of what it all means, it seems to me pretty clear. This is a response to the fan base. This is what the fan base wants. To your point, I mean, it's anecdotal evidence, but it's like perfect evidence. S just dies when he gets in there. The flower wilts, of enthusiasm. And for a kind of product that's built on go, engine, go, that can't be good. But to me, I understand why the UFC did it. You have to acknowledge that his dominance, at a minimum, declined. I can acknowledge that. It's not like he was number one in the world. What happened here? But the truth is, either you respect the idea that the elite of the world should be grouped for fleshing out the purposes of finding the best among them, or you don't. And it's a clear choice the UFC fan base has made. We want most of the elite, but not all of them, if we can get some lesser talented guys who are a little more exciting.
Yeah, going back to what you were talking about, being in the arena, and I was thinking about this a little bit after this cut, because I was thinking that there are about, by my measurement, there are about 5 different ways of watching a fight. If you're one of us who's sitting in press row, you're about 10 feet from the fighters, right in the front row. But there's also people in the arena that, and I've been in the auxiliary press area where you're way up in the rafters and you look down there and it's like 2 ants looking at each other. And to watch some kind of grappling thing, I know that there are screens everywhere, but if you're watching it, it's really hard to understand and appreciate what's going on. Sometimes it's hard to appreciate it sitting on press row. Watching on TV, you get a little closer angle, you might get a little bit more appreciation. But I imagine that those arenas, to me, watching like Shields and Maia, these are 2 masterful grapplers, and yeah, that arena, to me, should have been a little more electric to see how they dealt with each other. But it wasn't, because it's hard to really appreciate, even for someone like myself. You know, I'm not a jiu-jitsu practitioner like you are, Luke, but I still can appreciate what these guys can do to each other. But it's hard to if you are sitting, 150 feet away and you're watching these two guys rolling around the mat. You're basically watching two guys rolling around on a mat. That's what you're watching.
And there is a little bit of aspect here that we're basically saying, can this guy can he knock anybody out? I mean, it's a true thing in the UFC. That's what they reward. They sort of gear it towards high intensity fights like that. You just don't see it on Jake's resume, man. You could go back quite a ways before you could find somebody that he's knocked out. You just don't get the sense that he can end the fight suddenly. Unless it's a submission, and we haven't even seen that of late. And so it's either he's going to get knocked out. He's only been knocked out once since 2000. It's that sort of predictability. That was the Jake Ellenberger one. That was pretty. I remember the crowd was very into that night. But that sort of predictability is just very strange in this game. Whatever it is though, it's like it has to have drama kind of carrying in, and hopefully that drama plays out one way or the other. But with him, it's almost like you knew what to expect, and you got it. And therefore, it felt like even more of a thud a lot of times.
But I don't want to, what we're saying about Jake Shields, we're kind of throwing him under the bus here a little bit. Not maliciously, I suppose, but, listen, if you want to make the claim that Jake Shields was as exciting as Cain Velasquez, you're going to have a hard time. Yeah. We're not going to say that. But at some point, if you have an organized sport, and the UFC, listen, other promoters and other combat sports can get away with cutting a guy like Shields a little more easily because they're not trying to be the one-all, be-all. The UFC positions itself as the league of the best. Mm-hmm. And I understand it's a talking point. I'm not trying to hold him to it in a literal terms, but it's, and it's a sliding scale about when you want to cut guys and when you don't. But for me, you have to make a choice as a fan. Does it matter to you, Ariel, Jeff, Chuck, does it matter to you to have these guys grouped? Because the reason why Jake Shields is as good as he is, his style's effective. Look at his resume. He had a lot of career success fighting risk-averse. It's a reality.
He just beat Robbie Lawler, and Lawler is now positioned in the penultimate, going for his title.
So I understand he's not there's no doubt about it, he's not the fan-friendliest guy. That's not the issue. The issue is, do you keep a guy around who's good enough to be there? Either you do or you don't.
I'm a little torn on this one because, and I think you meant to say Tyron Woodley, right?
Yes.
Lawler was a few years back. But I'm torn because just last month we were sitting here saying if that whole little tournament at UFC 171 went down, doesn't matter what those other guys do. If Jake Shields wins, he's the #1 contender. We didn't say that about Fitch going into his last fight. We didn't say that about Okami. He was that close to being considered, at least in our eyes, the #1 contender. Who knows about the UFC?
Quick point: they didn't offer him another contract. They just let him go. That to me was a little weird. They didn't even give him a chance for maybe he would have not taken it, but no offer at all.
After a loss like that to Lombard, it was fairly one-sided. They had their out. But he was so close to being really, the #1 guy, and that's what makes it a little weird. But then on the flip side, and also we should say there are 49 events this year. They need all the ranked guys they can get. They like having that number next to the guys. I know that for a fact. We want to say, we're the UFC here, we want to say, number 8, Jake Shields is fighting on this fight night card. So you need those guys. But it just shows that, like you said, if you're not knocking people out, if you're not getting the crowd excited, if you're 35 years old, there's no place for you in the UFC. And it's interesting, he's on his way out, and Gina Carano might be on her way in. And on Wednesday...
She's only 31.
Exactly. So she's got a good 4 years. On Wednesday at a media luncheon in Los Angeles, Dana White and Ronda Rousey showed up. Ronda Rousey just shows up to explain to us that this woman, Gina Carano, deserves this title shot. If the terms can be, hashed out, because if it wasn't for her, Ronda wouldn't be here.
Yeah.
And
isn't Royce Gracie getting a title shot?
Exactly.
Against,
so they were putting, and they don't do this doesn't happen by coincidence. They're putting on the sell here. This is a real thing. This is in the midst of happening. This is evolving. This is fluid. Jeff, you wanna jump in here? Your thoughts on?
I'm really excited by this one.
Please.
But I sort of want to, it inspires in me some other matchmaking, because I know that we've talked about how like Aldo was sort of cleaned out his division pretty much. Just, was it like this past week or week or so ago, we find out that the UFC's new video game is going to have some guy named Bruce Lee in it, right?
Yes.
So
He's not
he
gonna be
weighed
signed.
pretty much around the same as Aldo. Why don't we get Bruce Lee in a fight with Aldo?
The hologram?
I mean, I know he's been. I know,
Coachella with Tupac.
I know Bruce Lee's been dead for 40 years, but he earned a shot at Jose Aldo.
Maybe like a weekend at Bernie's.
I mean, Chuck, don't you think? Wouldn't you buy that pay-per-view?
This is like that John Quincy Adams thing you went off on.
Are you trying to say that Gina Carano deserves a shot at Ronda Rousey's title just as much as Bruce Lee does against Jose
Less.
Aldo? Less, even less.
Yes.
Okay,
Even though she's alive.
right.
Less.
That's
It's a
how-
ridiculous tact. I mean, come on. It's
how little.
ridiculous to say that this person really inspired me to be where I am, therefore she deserves it. That just makes no sense. That doesn't even.
How is this
that doesn't
different
even
than
register.
boxing? I'll play devil's advocate. I'll play Mike Chiappetta for a second. How is this different than boxing where...
Devil's advocate or hater?
Wait, are you going to get drunk because UConn won the championship?
No,
You're
I'm
not going to
not.
do that.
Which, the women's one or the men's?
Both.
Yeah.
He's done.
So how is this different than Floyd Mayweather picking his next opponent?
Oh, it's not. I mean, it's just a different mechanism. Floyd literally held up a contest. Everyone picked one guy because I'll have the other one. Thanks.
Right.
And he's still going to sell out MGM. You know, it's
So how is
crazy.
this different?
It's not. It's not. It's totally arbitrary. It's a cash grab. It's good. Let's be clear. I mean, it's so dumb. It's so dumb. It's going to work. It's going to work. I follow just a few fans on Twitter. And that's anecdotal evidence. I understand. But everyone on Twitter was like, yes, can't wait. And I'm thinking to myself, like...
Really? Because I'm getting a lot of negativity.
It's just hardcore fans.
Yeah, that's true.
They don't know what they're talking
Let the
about.
slide on the
Trust me. People, my brother, who he only asked me about like when Machida fights or stuff. He was like, dude, is it real? Is Ronda Rousey going to fight Gina Carano? And I'm like, wow, he pops up out of the woodwork. It must be for... Yeah, it's going to do gangbusters, but the logic they're using to set it up, they don't have any. So they're just inventing, hey, she likes green apples and she likes green apples. Let's have them fight it all.
And the difference is UFC has always been about like not trying to do the boxing way, not doing it this way. You know, they've been very vocal about that. That's where it's like it's always the hypocrisy behind
But
it.
the times have changed a little bit, right?
Yeah, they have changed a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, even with Chael Sonnen, we always talk about the Chael Sonnen thing. You get into this, you realize that there's a certain time for this, and maybe that's it. Maybe that's where you're at this point in time. There are other names. The two most intriguing names are just not in the UFC right now. The Cyborg Santos, or Justino, I guess, and Holly Holm, who's we don't know what her situation is. You got Alexis Davis and Kat Zingano. There are people there, but do any of them really come close to the...
At this point, Kat, in my opinion, she deserves the right to
Yes.
get that title shot. But if I were her, I'd probably take another fight. She's been out for so
her
long.
perspective, for sure,
I think UFC should offer it to her. She's been through so much. She earned it. But if I were her, but if you're Alexis Davis and even another one, I mean, it's hard to justify to them, right? And even Chris Cyborg, who beat her, and you're saying, you have to come down and win at 135.
You got to get some wins and World Series of Fighting first.
And in the same situation, they're both 145ers. It's like there's no real advantage there for Gina Carano in that sense either.
Crazy matchmaking in itself doesn't really offend me. It has to do with that brass and leather thing that they put around the waist. Is it worth something? I mean, I don't care if it was just you just want to throw Ronda and Gina in there. Fine, have fun, go, But when you have this championship belt that's supposed to signify something, you have to it has to signify something real. It just can't be, well, whatever. We'll just find somebody because they're going to sell tickets. That's just not what a champion does. And this whole thing that I know that Ronda Rousey is not afraid of fighting Cyborg, but this whole thing of, well, I'll go to 145 only for Gina Carano, but not for anybody else. That just screams of ducking an opponent. I mean, she's not ducking her out of fear, I don't think. It's just out of some other dislike or whatever, but that just is so distasteful to me.
Also, we're killing the boxing model for good reasons. The reason is because over time fans feel cheated. Mm-hmm. That's the major critique of the boxing model. You get taught something, you anticipate something, it ends up being a blowout that you knew the promoter just scammed you. That's what the thing is. I don't know. But the boxing model works. Like, people still... Have you seen the odds on Mayweather-Maidana? Mayweather is like a minus 1,000 favorite. That's more than when Cormier fought Cummins. Seriously, that's how much of a mismatch that is. But he's going to do ridiculous pay-per-view buys, in part because they just want to see Mayweather do his thing. And he's not very offensive either, I think a little bit is just, hey, we want to see Gina and Ronda fight. They're star, put them together. I don't know that there's so much invested in anything beyond that. So the boxing model, if you rely on it, it will undermine you in the end. But this one seems to me like the ultimate bubblegum fight. Let's just have some sweets. And if that's all that is, and they go back to finding contenders, these one-offs aren't the end of the world. Also, you just can't fight it. Like the horse left the barn, or whatever metaphor you want to use. This fight is happening.
How many buys do you think this gets?
Ooh, minimum 500,000.
Really?
Yeah, minimum. This
Wow.
one's gonna do well.
In this current age of the
Sure,
UFC.
sure.
You guys agree with that?
Are you haters?
We'll go
Anti-women over
Yeah.
here?
We'll go 499, 999, because I'm not buying it. I mean,
Is this like the Price is Right?
I will cover it as a farce. I will not dignify. I will write about it
Wow,
with
it really
all the
bothers
truth.
you.
I will write it. Because it's a farce. It's not real competition. I think WrestleMania is more legitimate.
Wow.
Here we go.
Sorry to really.
Hold me back, Liz. Hold me back.
I just saw the color leaders.
It really is. I mean, on so many levels, and I understand what you're saying. I know the horse has left the barn, but the wrong end of the horse led the barn, came out first.
All right, how about this tie-in? When Gina Carano was supposed to come back to Strikeforce a couple of years ago, she did a brief training camp with the Jackson-Winkeljohn team in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She never had that fight. Remember, she showed up on Showtime and then had a strange illness, and that was it for her MMA career. Well, there's a new horse riding into town, potentially in Albuquerque, and that could be Alistair Overeem. He's met with them, close to agreeing to doing his next camp there, and he's fought a couple of those guys, Frank Mir, Travis Brown, beat one, lost to one. What do you think of this? Is this what Alistair Overeem needs?
At this point, I don't know what Alistair Overeem needs. I mean, he's one of those guys that it has to be about Alistair Overeem. Like, he needs to figure out something about himself, I feel like, because he's sort of bounced around. He's in Thailand, he's in, he's in Europe, he's at the Black Zillions. In every case, unless it's sort of tailored to him specifically, he's not really one for team anyway. I don't really believe he's one of those guys who's going to go to Jackson's and be like this big part of their team. It'd be interesting to see what the guys there do with him, how they might like tweak, what he's doing in the cage. But in terms of all the other stuff, I mean, after so long, and you know so much about who Alistair Overeem is, he's not going to change as a human being. And I'm not putting him down for that. I don't know if being a part of a team like that matters to him, like maybe what's in place there already. So to me, I'm like, it might be a good experiment. We'll see we'll see how it goes if he ends up going there. But at the same time, until Alistair Overeem really embraces that sort of thing, like I want to go into a specific culture to better myself, I don't really see it making that much of a difference.
Now, wait a second. Errol goes to you first. He mentions Jackson's camp. He mentions Albuquerque. He mentions Overeem, and he mentions horse. And you don't even like.
I'm giving you a little volleyball, so you can spike it. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, go to Twitter, folks, and then he made the funniest joke of the year about that. I won't even repeat it.
That was very good.
But if you're going to go, if he is going to become a team member, that'd be awesome. But if he's, it seems to me that the biggest hole in Alistair Overeem's game, the only hole that I see, I mean, other than like some cardio stuff, is up here. He just seems like a guy who doesn't have a head for this game, and the best place to be is with Greg Jackson. I mean, that's a guy who is going to get into the inner game with him, and if anybody's going to reach him, it's going to be this guy. So we'll see.
Well, we
see
said this about guys like Melvin Guillard. There's been other guys who are sort of journeymen, and they sort of hit upon wherever, and it's just it does become interesting. What can he do? What does Greg Jackson do? How does that translate? That is an interesting thing, but at the same time, just from the record of where Alistair Overeem has been, what he's done, and sort of the reports of working with him, things like that. I don't know. It just seems like it doesn't matter who he's working with until he sort of corrects himself.
Yeah. Overeem is a guy who benefits more from having a boxing style camp where it's built around him rather than being part. You know this, and you know this as well. I think he's never really thrived long term in team environments. That's the case with Golden Glory. It was the case with the Black Zillions. He's just not built for it. I mean, not to say not at all built for it, but it eventually crumbles. I don't think he's built that way. But two sort of major takeaways. One, I know that the Winkeljohn Jackson team were looking for heavyweights. The departure of Sean Jordan left not a lot of heavyweights there. They had a couple of them, the two, Brown and Mir.
When I was there, by the way, sorry to interrupt, Brown was the only heavyweight in the entire gym.
It's a problem. It's a
I
problem.
asked him about it.
I think they don't want to lose those guys in that camp, so that solves that problem internally. Yeah. The second one, though, is listen. I think Jackson's certainly a strategist and coach and mentor that capable, can do great things for anybody. But at the age Overeem is and the skills that he's got, he is who he is. There might be a performance here, a performance there he can tweak, but that's the only kind of adjustment that's available to somebody at this stage in their career. Overhaul, redo, renovation, it's not really possible.
we'll move along from Alistair Overeem because there's a lot to get to as we run out of time here. You had a very interesting interview with Lorenzo Fertitta earlier this week about
I thought it sucked. No, I'm teasing.
about the UFC ramping up random drug testing, and in my opinion, this is directly correlated to what George St. Pierre had been doing. And we were on this show and said, you know what, is that all he's really going to do? Is he just going to talk and that's it? He's not going to take this step further. But look, I mean, who knows? With TRT, that's gone. Now we're seeing this. Is this GSP's greatest victory? Is the UFC literally listening to this guy and changing everything they're doing because of what he said a couple months ago?
Yeah, I mean, I asked Lorenzo that exact question, and his response was, well, the ball was already rolling. We were already in the process of this. But, the ball can go and get in motion in slow motion. And it seems to me that the UFC might have been sort of talking about doing something like they're going to do, starting random testing with they were not specific on everybody, but they're going to be doing more random testing or paying for commissions to do it. And I suspect that they had that as something they were going to start doing, but I think the GSP criticism made this a little more urgent. And in fact, it's funny, when you interviewed John Jones out in Albuquerque and he revealed that he had asked for these tests, what occurred to me was I wouldn't be surprised if the UFC even made a little suggestion to him, almost like, well, why don't you ask us to do this? Because it's in their interest. It really is in their interest to some extent. Of course, it could backfire.
Good PR.
The first time, well, it's great PR for them, but also, especially this year where they can't afford to have any main events go away. Well, the first time some title fight goes away because somebody pops for something in a random test, there's going to be a lot of people who are pissed off. So there is that side of it, but yeah, this is the way the sport has to go, and I think they deserve the. I'm not going to say, well, they're just responding to GSP entirely. I think that maybe pushed it up and made it go a little faster. But to their credit, they're responding to something that needs to be responded to.
It does seem counterintuitive for the UFC to say we're going to take money out of our own pocket. If GSP hadn't done all this, hadn't sort of been on this crusade, for the UFC to actually take the initiative to do that, to me, it's like that's a telling thing. They're going out of their pocket. They used to yield to the commissions. We're yielding to the commissions on all of that stuff. Now all of a sudden they're paying for this to happen, and they have everything to lose. Obviously, if Glover Teixeira, for instance, pops hot for something, and then that's off. That's a pay-per-view that just went down the drain. So I feel like it's certainly a good look for them to look like as if they are finally paying it serious attention, that we finally got a spotlight on these things that are going on, and now we're going to test these guys ourselves. We're going to take the initiative in doing that, and I can't help but think that GSP was the catalyst for that.
Initiative, that's the key word. I looked at old interviews of Lorenzo, and what he said was, listen, if the commission asks us, we'll do it. Now they're proactive. Now they're asking the commission, please do this, and just send us the bill. That is the key difference. So it's your point. I do think they were interested in doing this kind of testing. They were ready to give the resources, not so much the labs, but the money to make all these things happen. But they were just sort of sitting on their hands, and now they're requesting it outright. And I think that is key. And really, when you combine that with the health insurance, I think the UFC's got some issues with how they pay their fighters. Clearly, that's how I believe. But I will say that's a pretty commendable thing they're doing. I mean, they should have been doing this all along. But relative to the rest of the operators and combat sports promoters, I don't know anybody who's doing anything like this.
They deserve to be applauded. Let's see how consistent this is. Let's see who gets random tested.
And Dana White said, we're going to test everyone on the card.
Right.
I want to see that. That should be interesting.
Now, I don't know if that was random
that
for everyone. That just seems like they're going to test everyone, fight week, whatever.
But we don't know.
Sure. There's a lot that could be done here. And the fact that they're doing it, who cares, who led to it all? I think it's a very good thing for the sport.
No, it matters if GSP did it, though.
Well,
it matters big time.
At the end of the day, I think it doesn't really matter. But yes, that's why I brought up the question. It's important to know, and I think this is his greatest victory, without a doubt. If he can change the entire culture of the sport and the way guys are drug tested, yes. End of the day, you just want the sport to be clean.
Sure, but I mean, we asked the question, does major fighter complaining through media affect change? We might have the answer yes here. That is because that goes back to Nick Diaz, it goes back to Nate Diaz. Does that matter?
But also the part of the change is not just that the that the random testing has started, but also the random testing starting might lead to GSP coming back once his knee heals. So that was part of the part of the question with him has always been, well, are you going to come back? And he, part of we always focus it on his headspace, but part of it was he just didn't want to come back to a sport he didn't feel was clean or that he felt had shady practices. Well, that part of it seems to be eliminated. So now it's just going to be his personal decision.
Earlier this week, it was announced that the new UFC 174 main event, or the UFC 174 main event, is Demetrious Johnson versus Ali Bagautinov. That's in Vancouver, British Columbia in June. Are you buying Demetrious Johnson, who, by the way, has main evented 3 Fox shows in a very short amount of time, and you would think that's sort of the catalyst of becoming a pay-per-view draw. Yeah. Are you buying him against Bagautinov as the main event of a pay-per-view later on this year?
It depends. Do I have to write about it? No. Yeah, of course. If I'm a casual fan or if I'm a fan of mixed martial arts, it's a little different because we've seen Demetrious Johnson for free over the last little bit of time. It's one of those things you're like, is it you're now in a pickle where they have to put guys like him. This is a perfect opportunity to see how he does in a pay-per-view because they don't have other options for these things. To me, you were mentioning this before. He's a guy who knocks people out. He fights very dynamic. He adapts in a fight. He does everything that you would want in a fighter. You know what I mean? Like you watch him do this stuff, and it's actually fairly a marvel to watch him sort of fight in there. So to me, yes, I've watched him along. He's been on the free TV showcases for a long time. Yeah, I'm really interested in it. I would like to see them fortify the card a little bit more. Right now, they've got the welterweight sort of title eliminator that's going on between Tyron Woodley and
Roy McDonald?
Yeah, and Roy McDonald. Well, that's a pretty good fight. But you'd like to see them put one more good fight on that card to sort of like have a 3-piece. And then
we're not the right people to ask because we're going to cover it. We talk about this every week. But will the casual fan, after seeing him on Fox, like if he can't be a viable pay-per-view draw right now after main eventing 3 Fox shows and some of them in like primetime December football season playoffs, then when can he? Right?
Yeah, right. Well, Chuck and I were having this conversation as we were walking over here about, why is it that fans don't embrace the littler fighters? And we were thinking, well, is it just because we all want to see somebody who's really big and fight against each other? But when you really think about it, when I look at, say, some big heavyweight, Cain Velasquez, the fact that Cain Velasquez can kick my ass really is not that big of a deal because he's a big guy. He should be able to do that. But the fact that Demetrious Johnson at 125 pounds can beat me up, that's pretty impressive. And so I always look at the opposite side of it, that some of those littler guys, it's really impressive that they're so tough. And Demetrious Johnson, you talk about the 3 cards, his last 3 fights, fight of the night, submission of the night, knockout of the night. I mean, what does the guy have to do to impress people?
He has to make them care, and it won't happen with the way he fights. I've said it on the show before. Demetrious Johnson, if you ever met him, is the nicest, most normal dude who will beat the tar out of you.
Also a huge fan of this show.
Yes, and
watches it every week.
I met him before the Dominic Cruz fight, and couldn't be a nicer guy. Incredible athlete, incredible fighter, everything you would want from a champion, but hasn't found a way. The guy next door is not particularly interesting. The guy next door who can fight very well is a little more interesting, but it doesn't really round the corner. To me, it's a question of one of 2 things. I'm not sure which one it is. Is it an indictment on the Fox model of graduation? That we put you on this platform, you gain enough exposure, and then we can now monetize you behind a paywall. That may not be the case, or may, we'll find out. But the other issue for me is maybe the model does work. Maybe we do put you on TV and then we put you behind a paywall, and maybe Demetrious Johnson wasn't the right guy. Maybe there was another guy like an Anthony Pettis who has got a little bit of edge and certainly is a punishing damager. Not that Demetrious Johnson isn't in his own right, but there's something a little different, the chemistry in the air about Anthony Pettis. So to me, it's a question of that model. The model they're trying to set up, because before, remember, you used to be able to put #1 contender fights and then the winner of that, and that didn't really translate exactly. So to me, this is going to be a question about whether the Fox model works or whether that Fox model's been used appropriately.
And let's not forget, you always need a dance partner, and this is a tough one. The guy didn't speak English. He's fought on 1 pay-per-view recently. He's kind of a grinder. Ali Bagautinov, not flashy at all. So
he'll bang it out.
No, but I mean, as far as the draw is concerned, Demetrious is doing this on his own.
Oh, 100%.
And that's what I'm saying. You need a dance partner to sell this thing. End of the day, is this a mistake?
No, I don't. I mean, can you really? How many times can you go back to that Fox well?
Right.
You got to change it up. I understand that. Listen, the guy is who he is. They got a great champion. He's doing everything that's asked of him. Not everybody can be, super Mr. Charisma. It's just, it's it's not an indictment on him personally. It's just kind of who you are. So not a mistake, but definitely for you. To your point, they got to strengthen the rest of that card.
And they don't have much choice here either. I mean,
Sure.
realize there are 11 pay-per-views to go this year. They've got 4 champions on the shelf. They've got another champion making a movie. If you calculate it out and figure a couple, like John Jones, if he wins this month, he can fight maybe one other fight. If you figure it out, if you want to have a champion on every pay-per-view, he's got to be on one. So in a way, he may also just be a victim of his success. I mean, when he won the championship, I think he was an underdog against Benavidez. And he won the fight. It was a tight one. And then when they got the rematch, if Benavidez had come out and beaten him, and then they had to have that rubber match, maybe there would be a little bit more something stirred up here. But he went out and just wasted Benavidez in 2 minutes. So where's the pushback?
And it's funny that we were talking about Gina Carano stepping in, and it's like, oh, this luxurious thing that the UFC might do, and it doesn't make any sense. Well, these fights, UFC 173 and 174, just happen in a time when necessity is all we're seeing. Because T.J. Dillashaw, suddenly being put into a top spot like that is the similar kind of thing. It's like he's a very nice guy. He's particularly unhateable, but do we care? Like you can't figure out which way. You're not even sure you care enough to watch it. And I feel like that's where you're at. We got 2 necessities going on back to back, and it makes the second one stick out that much more. That you're like, well, now we have 2 sort of lower, smaller weight guys, smaller weight titles going up, back to back. That's where it all sort of gets glaring to me.
We have run out of time. But we have to quickly mention Antonio Rodrigo Nogueira versus Roy Nelson. That is taking place Friday afternoon here in the United States.
What time is your plane leave? You got to get out of there.
Yeah, exactly. I'll ask it very quick. Down the line, does Big Nog have to win against Roy Nelson to prolong his MMA career?
Also, Roy Nelson. He's had 2 losses in a row too. I don't think a loss is the worst thing in the world for either guy, but I think this one and another one for either of them, and that's it.
So you think there's as much pressure on both? I was thinking a little more on Big Nog, but you think it's pretty equal?
A little more on Roy Nelson, to be honest. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What do you think?
I would say they're both pretty much in the same boat. I mean, maybe Nog seems like he's got a little bit more wear and tear, and but Nelson also has that other factor of not being very liked by the boss.
Just signed a new deal though.
Yeah.
Depending on how these guys look, I would say that both of them obviously are in a vicarious, precarious situations. They're both on that bubble, but at the same time, they're in a division where there just aren't that many names. So I feel like they're probably safe ultimately, regardless.
For now.
Yeah, for now.
Yeah.
For now.
A little different than a lightweight or a welterweight where it's a little more packed, but we'll see what happens. That is Friday, of course, in Abu Dhabi. So that is it for us. And a quick programming note, we are off for the next 2 weeks. We'll be back in 3 weeks' time. We were a little, I think we were spoiling the viewers with a show every week for the last 2.5 months or so, but we're taking a bit of a break. We'll be back after UFC 172, so we hope you don't miss us all that much. And of course, we want to hear from you about anything we talked about in a very busy week in the world of mixed martial arts. Tell us what you're looking forward to in the next couple of weeks. The UFC very busy. I counted, I believe, 14 events in the next 13 weeks.
Yay!
So buckle up. And that's just the UFC, not talking about other promotions. So a lot coming up, and we'll be back in a few weeks to discuss about what has transpired in Quebec City and Baltimore and everywhere in between. For Luke, Jeff, Chuck, I'm Ariel. Thank you so much for watching another episode of the MMA Beat right here on MMAfighting.com. We'll see you next time.